You can't even keep a roof over her head. What kind of father does that make you?" Nora said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing in the car on the way home. Flat, final, like a verdict she'd already filed with someone who mattered. Across the kitchen table, Liam Hadley said nothing. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who worked with them, collused along the palm, a faint chemical stain on the right thumb that no amount of soap had ever fully reached, the kind of hands that embarrassed Nora at dinner parties, which was why he had stopped going to dinner parties 3 years ago. In the hallway, their daughter Paige stood in her socks on the hardwood floor. She was 9 years old and she had gone very still, the way she went still when she was trying to become invisible. She had her father's eyes, and right now they were wide and fixed on the kitchen doorway, taking in every word. Liam saw her. He always saw her. "Lower your voice," he said. "Why? So she doesn't know the truth." Nora pulled the envelope from her bag and dropped it on the table between them. "She's 9, Liam. She already knows. Kids always know when things aren't working." The envelope was cream-colored, the kind lawyers use. His name was typed on the front in a clean sans serif font that felt deliberately impersonal. He did not reach for it. "I had this drawn up last week," Nora said. "I've signed my side. I just need yours." Liam looked at the envelope. Then he looked at the wall behind her, at the drawing Paige had taped there in September, a lopsided house with a sun that had too many rays and 3 figures standing in front of it, one tall, one medium, one small, all holding hands. "There's someone else," Nora said, and her chin came up the way it always did when she expected a fight. "His name is Garrett Webb. He's in commercial development. Vancouver Island. He has a house, Liam, an actual house with a yard that isn't a parking lot. He looks at me like I'm going somewhere." Liam had known the name. He had heard it in the background of phone calls Nora didn't know he could hear, through the thin wall of their apartment in Nanaimo. He had known what it meant and had said nothing, because there are things a man can see coming and still not be ready to catch when they arrive. "All right," he said. Nora blinked. "All right, that's it. What would you like me to say?" She stood there a moment longer than she intended to. Then she picked up her bag and said she would send a car for her things on the weekend, and that they would work out an arrangement for Paige. And Liam repeated the words, "Work out an arrangement for Paige," in the same quiet tone he used for everything, and something about the flatness of it made her look at him sharply before she left. She left at 7 in the evening. Liam heard the door and then heard the street, and then heard nothing. Paige appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear, the ear that had been resewn twice, the stitching slightly raised along the seam where his fingers were larger than the job required. He had still done it. That was the kind of man he was. "Is Mom coming back?" Paige asked. Liam crouched down so they were the same height. He did this every time he needed her to know he was listening for real. "Not to live here," he said. She thought about that. The rabbit swung from her hand. "Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," he said. And he meant it completely, which was the thing about Liam Hadley that almost no one in Nanaimo understood. The apartment on Brechin Hill smelled of sawdust and coffee, and faintly of the wood stain he used in the evenings. Liam had lived there for 2 years, which was long enough that he had stopped noticing the smell, and short enough that Paige still sometimes asked when they were going home, meaning somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't an apartment over a hardware store on a street that flooded every March. He was, by any account the neighborhood could access, an unremarkable man. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck. He did contract carpentry and small renovations, showing up at people's homes in a canvas jacket with a mantle behind his ear and leaving their kitchens better than he found them. He did not talk much. He was good with his hands and fair with his pricing, and he always came back to fix things that weren't right, which in the trades made him something close to a legend, and in his marriage had apparently meant nothing at all. What the neighborhood could not access was the locked room at the back of the apartment, a small space he used as a home office, which Paige had been told held tax documents and tools and boring adult papers. That was true, in the way that calling the ocean a puddle is technically true. The notice from the building manager arrived on a Tuesday, 4 weeks behind on rent. Liam read it at the kitchen counter while Paige ate toast. He had the money. He could have had it transferred in the time it took to pour coffee. Instead, he called the building manager and asked for 5 more days and was told, in the particular tone reserved for people who are behind on rent, that his situation was not the manager's problem, and that children needed stable housing that their fathers were apparently unable to provide. Liam thanked him for his time and hung up and said nothing about it to Paige. On Thursday, he came out of the hardware store to find his truck with a long scratch down the driver's side panel, the kind of scratch that is not an accident. Both front tires were flat. Nothing had been taken from the cab. He crouched beside the nearest tire and looked at the cut and understood immediately that this was not random. Vandals take things. This was a message. Someone had decided that Liam Hadley needed to understand that staying in Nanaimo was going to cost more than he had. He thought about Garrett Webb, who had money and connections, and the kind of local influence that meant your calls were returned the same day. He had not yet connected the dots into a full picture, but Liam had spent a significant portion of his adult life reading the difference between chaos and intention, and this had intention all through it. Paige was with him when he started sweeping the broken glass from the taillight someone had also kicked in. Did somebody do this on purpose? He looked at her. Maybe. Because of us. Because of me, he said. Not you. Never you. She nodded slowly, the way she was beginning to nod when things were too large for her to hold, but she trusted him to hold them for her instead. 2 nights later, Nora arrived at the apartment with a key she hadn't returned, which turned out to be the kind of detail that reveals a person. She said she needed some of her books. She moved through the apartment like someone conducting an inspection, and Paige sat on the couch and watched her mother open drawers, and Liam watched Paige watching her mother and felt something old and specific tighten in his chest and kept it entirely off his face. Nora paused at the doorway of the small back office. This room is always locked, she said. I know. What's in it? Papers, he said. Tools, nothing you need. She looked at him with an expression that had become familiar over 3 years. The expression of a woman who suspected she was being managed and couldn't prove it, and resented both things equally. Then she gathered her books and left, and Liam stood at the window and watched her get into a silver sedan idling at the curb, the kind of car that cost more than his truck was worth. He signed the papers on a Wednesday morning, before Paige was awake, at the kitchen table, with the same pen he used to mark measurements on lumber. He read nothing. There was nothing in it he needed to read. When Nora came to collect them, she stood for a moment at the door with the signed pages in her hand, and she looked at him with something complicated in her face, something that might have been the beginning of doubt, if she'd had more time with it, and she said, I already know how it ends. Liam said, You made your choice months ago. I've just been waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She left. He made Paige's lunch and drove her to school and kissed the top of her head and walked back to the truck alone. That night, his phone rang at 11:43. He knew the number. A Toronto exchange, a private line that existed on fewer than 8 contact lists in the country. He had not heard it ring in nearly 3 years. He had been sure that it almost never had reason to. He answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was the general counsel of Hartwell Capital Group, a man named Price, who chose every word with the precision of someone who billed by them. He spoke for less than 2 minutes. The Alderton acquisition, a $17 billion restructuring that spanned 4 provinces and 3 separate holding entities, was failing. The original deal architecture, which Liam had designed and then walked away from, was the only structure that could save it. The board had voted. They needed him present. Not advising through intermediaries. Present and visible. You understand what that means, Price said. Once we announce your involvement, your name is on the front page of every financial paper in the country. There's no walking that back. Through the wall, Liam could hear Paige's slow breathing in the next room. I understand, he said. He set the phone down on the kitchen table. He sat there for a while in the dark, in the apartment that smelled of sawdust and coffee, the apartment a woman had just left because the man who lived in it would never amount to anything. Then he crossed to Paige's doorway and stood watching the small shape of his daughter breathe beneath her blanket. Tomorrow, he said quietly to her, to himself, to a city that had absolutely no idea what was coming. Tomorrow, everything changes. By morning, the financial news had its headline. A filing made through Hartwell's counsel before dawn named the founder of Hartwell Capital Group, until now identified only as a numbered trust and a signature, as the wealthiest individual in British Columbia. The number that ran across the morning programs was large enough that the anchors said it twice, as though they expected it to change. On Brechin Hill, the wealthiest individual in British Columbia made toast. He cut it diagonally, because Paige had told him once that diagonal toast tasted better, and he had never stopped doing it that way. He drove her to school in the scratch truck because it still ran. And he kissed the top of her head and told her to be brave and watched her walk through the doors in her good sneakers, the ones he had bought secondhand and resoled himself 2 weeks earlier, the new heel holding firm, the seam invisible if you didn't know where to look. To anyone who passed him on the street that morning, he was the same man he had been the day before, the carpenter with the canvas jacket and the pencil behind his ear. He was, in fact, doing this deliberately. He had spent nearly 3 years perfecting the specific discipline of not being found, and he intended to control exactly when and how that ended. In the weeks that followed, Nora arranged herself into the life she had chosen. There were photographs. She appeared at a Harborview restaurant opening on Garrett's Arm. She was quoted in a lifestyle column about a renovation project. She attended a foundation dinner at a hotel in Victoria that Liam recognized from the background of a photo someone sent him without context or explanation. She had a new address in a building on the water. Her name appeared beside Garrett's in the kind of contexts where names appear when things are going well, which meant that, for the moment, things appeared to be going well. Meanwhile, Liam's life in Nanaimo became narrower in ways that were too precise to be coincidental. A general contractor he had worked with for 2 years stopped returning calls. The building manager, who had been passively hostile for months, became actively so. A second notice taped to the door, a call to Paige's school that Liam heard about secondhand, a quiet word in the neighborhood about the kind of man who couldn't keep his household in order. Paige felt it in the specific way children feel the things adults don't explain. A boy at school had started calling her a name that children use for other children whose families are coming apart. She came home one afternoon with a scrape on her palm that she said was from the playground, and that Liam understood was not from the playground. He cleaned it at the kitchen sink without asking her to explain it. "They said you can't look after me," Paige said, her voice very small over the running water. "They said Mom left because we don't have anything." Liam dried her hand with a dish towel and crouched down to her level. "What do you think?" She considered it seriously the way she considered things. "You fixed my shoes," she said. "I did, so they don't know you." "No," Liam said. "They don't know me." And he said nothing else. Because there are things you cannot explain to a 9-year-old without also explaining the parts that would take the weight of childhood off her shoulders and replace it with something heavier. And he was not ready to do that. The financial pages had been running the same story in different shapes for nearly a month. Hartwell Capital Group, a fund so deliberately opaque that even its board had operated for years, with only partial knowledge of the person at the top, had designed the largest corporate restructuring in Canadian history. The founder had never given an interview, had never appeared at an industry event. The name behind the trust had become a kind of mythology, a reclusive heir, a foreign entity, a legal fiction invented to hold assets without accountability. The mystery had grown so large that it had become its own weather system, and the entire financial community lived under it and speculated and arrived at nothing. Nora read these stories the way everyone did, with the vague fascination people bring to things that are dramatic and distant. She never connected the man in the headlines to the man who had sat across from her at a kitchen table with calloused hands and said, "All right," when she handed him an envelope. The evening it broke open was a Thursday in October at the Meridian Summit in Toronto, an annual gathering of the country's most significant investors. The kind of event where the people who moved capital came to be seen moving it. Garrett had flown in specifically for the occasion. He had a table near the front. He arrived with Nora in a dark green dress that she had bought for the trip, and for the first hour they were exactly what they had come to be. A couple ascending, photographed noted. Nora felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was in the right room. Then the room changed. It started near the entrance. A turning of heads, a dropping of voices, the kind of hush that moves through a crowd the way a wave moves, visibly, from person to person, until the whole surface of the room has changed. Nora felt it before she understood it. Men who had been mid-sentence stopped. A woman who had been laughing covered her mouth. The CEO of one of the largest pension funds in the country crossed the room with his hand already extended before the man he was crossing it for had reached him. The man who had walked in wore a dark suit and nothing else remarkable. He moved without hurry and without any apparent awareness of the disruption he was causing, which was itself a kind of power so total that the room seemed to bend around it. Nora's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She knew the walk before she let herself know anything else. She knew the set of the shoulders, the absolute stillness of a man who had never once needed to take up more space than he occupied. She knew the way he carried quiet through a loud room like a stone carries cold out of a river. Her hand was trembling. It was Liam. A microphone had appeared at the front of the room and the host of the summit was saying something that Nora could not fully hear over the sound of her own pulse. And then Liam stepped to the podium, and the entire room went still. In the way a room goes still, when it understands, it is watching something it will describe for years. For 3 years, Liam said, and his voice filled the space without effort, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it. You've been trying to find the person behind Hartwell Capital. You've built theories. You've traced holding companies. You've hired people to trace holding companies. The faintest pause. The room did not breathe. My name is Liam Hadley. I founded Hartwell Capital 12 years ago. I am its principal shareholder and the architect of the Alderton structure, and the restructuring that every institution in this room has money riding on will proceed or collapse on a decision I make this week. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of several hundred very sophisticated people simultaneously discovering that everything they thought they knew about a situation needed to be rebuilt from the floor up. Nora could not move. Her mind was doing something involuntary, throwing images at her in rapid succession. The locked-back room, the calls he took outside and never explained, the men who had occasionally appeared at the apartment in expensive coats and been quietly turned away before she could ask who they were, the signet ring she had found once in his jacket pocket and been brushed off about, the ring with a crest she now suddenly understood. She had seen in the corner of every Hartwell document she had ever glanced at in a waiting room. She had been married to the man in the headlines. She had watched his hands at dinner parties and felt embarrassed by the stain on his thumb and filed papers to remove him from her life because he was going nowhere. Across the table, Garrett had gone the color of unfinished drywall. His mind was running its own calculation, and the number it kept landing on was making his breathing shallow. His development project on Vancouver Island, the one that had positioned him as visionary, the one that the Kalalams had called bold, the fencing that he had traced through 2 intermediaries and a numbered company, and then decided not to trace further, had been financed 18 months ago by Hartwell Capital. He had built his entire recent rise on the quiet money of the man whose wife he had taken. He understood in the space of 30 seconds that he had not been Nora's escape from Liam. He had been Liam's patience, made visible. The reception rearranged itself after that in the way water rearranges itself when the terrain shifts. People who had not registered Liam an hour earlier now positioned themselves to be near him, and Liam moved through them with a courtesy that never warmed past professional, and he found Nora across the room once with his eyes in the particular way of a man registering someone he used to know, and then he turned back to a conversation about restructured debt that was worth more than everything Garrett Webb owned. It was Nora who came to him. She found him near a window overlooking the city, the lights of Toronto doing what city lights do at night, pretending everything below them is manageable. "You let me believe." Her voice broke and she steadied it. 3 years, Liam. You let me think we were running out of time. You let me think you had nothing. I never told you I had nothing, Liam said. His tone was not unkind, and that was what made it devastating. There was no cruelty in it anywhere, only a settled, permanent calm. You decided that on your own, and I didn't correct you. That's different. Why? She pressed her fingers against her own sternum like she was holding something in. Why didn't you just tell me? If you'd told me, if I'd told you, he said quietly, you would have stayed. And that's exactly the problem. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes that he did not let reach his face. I needed to know if you wanted the man who fixed things with his hands. As it turns out, you didn't. You made that very clear. And I'd rather know that than spend another 3 years wondering. He stepped past her into the crowd, and she stood at the window alone, and the lights of the city outside had not changed at all. What he did not say, what he said to no one, was where that clarity had come from. Before Nora, before Nanaimo, before the canvas jacket and the carpentry and the apartment over the hardware store, there had been a different life. He had run Hartwell from a glass tower in Toronto with a team of 40, and the particular ruthlessness that comes from being very good at something and knowing it too early. He had been in rooms where the decisions made moved markets. He had also been in rooms where the people who loved him were used as leverage by men who understood that the fastest way to control a person is to reach for whatever they would break to protect. The woman it had cost him was named Iris. She had loved him when he was still learning what he was capable of, and she had stood beside him as it became clear, and she had held everything that was tender in him carefully, while the world tried to grind it out. And when the grinding finally reached her, he had not been there to stop it. He had been in a boardroom in Calgary. He had been unreachable by design. And by the time he landed at Toronto General, she was already past the point where reaching him would have changed anything. He had walked out of Hartwell 3 weeks after the funeral. He had taken Paige, who was 6 weeks old, and did not yet understand what she was missing. And he had driven west until Nanaimo, which was far enough from Toronto that the men who measured people by their usefulness would have to work very hard to find him. He ran Hartwell through proxies and numbered trusts, and a legal architecture so thorough that for 3 years no one had even come close to the name underneath it. He had built the walls carefully. He had kept Paige inside them. He had married Nora as the man who lived inside those walls. The quiet one, the capable one, the one who resoled shoes and fixed toasters and never raised his voice. He had hoped, in the way that people hope for things they are not quite ready to examine, that she had wanted that man. She had not wanted that man. And he was no longer surprised by this. In the days that followed the summit, Garrett Webb's development fund began to experience the specific kind of difficulty that happens when the capital holding it aloft decides to stop. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. The intermediaries who had been helpful became formal. A bank that had been reliably accommodating became reliably busy. Lines of credit that renewed automatically in September did not renew automatically in October. Garrett made calls and felt the temperature of the city drop around him 1 degree at a time. He drove to the Hartwell offices in Toronto and talked his way past 2 people who were being deliberately unhelpful and found Liam behind a desk that Garrett would have restructured 3 companies to sit at. "You're destroying me," Garrett said. "Because of her. Because she chose me. You're going to burn all of this down over a woman." Liam closed the file he had been reading. He looked at Garrett with the same expression he used for incorrectly specified lumber orders, patient, slightly tired, prepared to explain exactly once. "I'm not destroying anything," he said. "I withdrew my support. That's all. What you built on top of it is your own accounting problem." He set the file to one side. You slashed my truck tires. You had a conversation with my building manager that you had no business having. You let your people say things to children that children should not be made to carry." He looked at Garrett steadily. "I'm answering. That's the entirety of what's happening here." Garrett's fund failed within the month. The columns that had called him bold called him in sequence, overextended, then troubled, then quiet. He left Vancouver Island for somewhere the columns weren't paying attention, which turned out to be difficult to find. Nora came to Nanaimo on a Sunday in November. She stood at the door of the apartment on Brechin Hill in plain clothes, the certainty gone from her face in a way that made her look younger and more tired at the same time. "I made a mistake," she said. "Liam, I made a serious mistake. We were a family. Paige needs. We could be a family again. For her. If not for me, then for her." In the next room, Paige had gone very still on the couch. Liam could tell by the silence. He set down the level he had been holding. "You didn't leave me because I was poor," he said. His voice was level, not unkind, the voice of a man who had spent a long time deciding what he believed and no longer needed to raise it to make the point. "I would have understood that. People are afraid of not having enough. I know what that fear does to people. I've seen it." He looked at her. "You left because you looked at me and decided I had no value. That I was a man who was going to stay exactly where he was and be nothing. You walked out to a car without looking back at the window where your daughter was standing. And nothing I am now changes what you saw then. You can't unsee it. And I can't unknow that you saw it." "That's not fair," Nora said. "No," Liam agreed. "Almost none of this has been fair." He picked up the level again. "Your taillight is out on the left side. You should get it seen to before you drive home." She left. In the next room, Paige was sitting on the couch with her rabbit in her lap, her small face very still and very old, having understood something in the past 5 minutes that most people do not understand until they are considerably older. She had heard her mother ask to come back. She had heard her father say no, calmly, without raising his voice, without cruelty, without any of the things that would have made it easier to be angry at him for it. She did not run to her mother. She did not say goodbye. That, more than anything, was what stayed with Nora on the drive home. The story spread the way these stories do, because the contrast was too clean, and the city could not look away from it. A man who had been doing carpentry in Nanaimo, who drove a scratch truck and lived over a hardware store and had his rent overdue, was the founder of Hartwell Capital. The largest restructuring in the country bore his fingerprint. The photographs ran everywhere. Liam at the Meridian Summit podium beside a grainy image someone had found of him loading lumber into the truck, and the contrast did more than any headline could have. He hated it. That was the part nobody printed. He moved through the attention with a stillness the cameras read as mystique, and that was, in fact, only a man enduring exactly what he had spent 3 years preventing his daughter from having to experience. He gave no interviews. He kept driving Paige to school himself through a brief crowd of photographers that thinned by the second week and was gone entirely by the third. Nora did not fare well in the telling. The woman who had left to be with a man who then collapsed within the month became, in the public mind, a figure people use to illustrate a specific kind of error, the one you make when you confuse the appearance of momentum for the thing itself. Her professional network, which had always been partly social and partly reputational, went quiet in the way that networks go quiet when they are deciding whether association is still useful. It was not a punishment. It was simply the same logic by which she had risen, working in the other direction. But that verdict was not the wound that mattered to her. The wound that mattered was 9 years old and received her calls and was polite on the phone. And when Nora came to take her for lunch, was perfectly well behaved and said the right things and looked at her mother with eyes that held none of the uncomplicated warmth they used to hold. Children forgive a great deal, clearly, and without ambiguity, exactly where they rank in a moment that counted. Liam watched it and did not intervene. He gave Nora the time she asked for, because Paige had called her mother for all 9 years of her life, and he would not be the one to take that from her. But he did not hurry it, and he did not soften it, and he did not explain to his daughter what to feel. He trusted her to find her own way to whatever she was going to feel, which was what he had always done. And it had never yet been wrong. In the spring, he bought the building on Brechin Hill and the two beside it and did not raise a single rent. The building manager, who had left eviction notices and made calls to schools, found himself retired on a buyout he had not expected and could not quite complain about. The families who lived in those buildings, the ones Garrett had spoken about clearing out for something profitable and glass-faced, stayed. Their rents stayed. The neighborhood became, quietly, the most stable place to be a working family in the entire city. He established a scholarship in Iris's name for the children of tradespeople, the kind of families whose kids walked to school in shoes that had been repaired once or twice and understood early what other children thought of them for it. He put her name on it, not his. The first awards went out before most of the city knew the fund existed. On a Saturday afternoon in April, Liam stood at the edge of a playground behind Paige's school, watching her run a relay with a group of kids who had, over the winter, simply become her friends. She was faster than she looked. She had always been faster than she looked, which was a thing she had inherited from him and he was privately proud of. Another parent came to stand at the fence beside him, a man he didn't know, watching his own kid on the other side of the field. The man glanced sideways, taking in the canvas jacket, the pencil still behind the ear out of old habit, the quiet way Liam occupied space. "Hey," the man said. "Sorry, I feel like I know you from somewhere." Aren't you the Hartwell guy? The one from the papers?" He laughed, slightly embarrassed. "You're actually here watching the relay race." Across the field, Paige crossed the finish line and turned immediately to find her father's face in the small crowd along the fence. She raised both arms. He raised one hand back. He turned to the man beside him, and there was something in the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. "No," Liam said. "I'm just a dad." The man started to say something else, but Liam had already turned back to the field where his daughter was now waving again, more urgently, in the way of children who need to be sure the one person who matters is still there and still paying attention. He raised his hand again. She grinned. She turned back to her friends, and the afternoon light came down even and soft across the field and the fence and the man who had once been called the wealthiest in the province, who wanted, in the end, only to be exactly where he was, watching his daughter run. Some men spend a lifetime building walls around what they love. The wisest ones also know how to live inside them.